I'd like to welcome you to the Lord's house this morning. I must admit that when I saw the theme, how shall we keep the Sabbath, I thought, I wish I were planning. And this morning when I walked in and I said something to a person about what the theme was, and they said, "Oh, are you going to chastise us for not keeping the Sabbath holy?" Well, I can tell you that those are not the words I was given. The scripture this morning comes from the book of Mark, the 2nd chapter, 23rd verse, to the 3rd chapter, the 6th verse. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never heard what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God, and he ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' Another time, when he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?' But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. The word Sabbath means to rest, to stop, to cease from work, a day of rest. The penalty for desecrating the Sabbath was death. The law prevented servant work, but the Pharisees prohibited all work, both good and evil. In my research about the Sabbath, I found the following were not permissible, along with about 100 other things that were not allowed. On the Sabbath, your journey could not be more than 3,000 feet from your domicile. Most people didn't live that close to the temple, so the rabbis got a little creative, and they decided as long as every 2,000 feet you had food and water, that could be considered your domicile. You could not rescue a drowning person. If you could tie and untie with one hand, that was okay. That was acceptable. If, however, you had to use both hands, that was considered work. If your ox fell into a ditch, you could rescue him. But if a man were to fall into the ditch, it would be his misfortune because he'd have to stay there till the next day. If you could drink vinegar as part of your food, however, if you took it to soothe a toothache, that was against the Sabbath. The one I especially liked was this one. If you were bitten by a flea, you had to continue to allow the flea to bite you. If you tried to stop the flea or killed the flea, you would be guilty of hunting on the Sabbath. It was an interesting research, believe me. In the scripture from Mark, the issue was not in the eating of the grain, for they were hungry, but in the picking of the grain. Jesus asked them if they had ever read the story of David and his companions. Now, these Pharisees were very learned men, and they prided themselves on knowing the scriptures well. But they were so caught up in the minutiae of legalism that they often missed the key truths. Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Pharisees emphasized the external obedience while ignoring internal motivation. What was the original purpose of the Sabbath? The Sabbath was God's idea, the principle being derived from the very beginning of creation. God created everything in 6 days and rested on the seventh and made it holy. The primary purpose was to give a working man a day of rest to balance the rhythm of life. It is clear that God intended the day to be a blessing to man, both physically and spiritually. The sanctity of the Sabbath before Jesus was shown by the offering of 2 lambs. Any other day during the week, they only offered sacrifice of 1 lamb. After the sacrifice of Jesus for us, we are no longer under the law, but under the grace of God. Our rest is not in the day, but in the person of Jesus Christ. The rabbis regarded the Sabbath as an end to itself, whereas Jesus taught that the Sabbath was made for man's benefit. When I was a child, we had what was known as the Blue Laws. Nothing was open on Sunday other than emergency services. I think they were open. I don't really remember, but I'm sure they were. No one worked their weekly job on Sunday. If there were things that you needed for the coming week, you either had to get them before Sunday or after Sunday. You had to plan ahead. In my home, we were expected to have our shoes shined, our clothes laid out, and our Sunday school lesson read by Saturday night. And my parents always checked to make sure those things had been done. We went to church services in the morning and in the evening on Sunday. However, we lived on 4.5 acres, and so there were chores to be done, regardless of what day it was. We had chickens, rabbits, pigs, and a variety of pets that had to be cared for and fed. As I remember it, we never missed church, ever, unless we were ill. However, there were things in our very large garden that oftentimes needed harvesting, and we had not been able to finish those on Saturday. That would be how we spent our Sunday afternoon. We would get cleaned up again for Sunday evening services. And then both my parents would probably spend the entire evening canning or preserving food for the winter. And then my dad would get up the next morning and go to work. Often, other large families would be invited in to help and to share in the harvest. My father felt that if the good Lord had blessed his family with the abundance of a great harvest, then he would not be a good steward if he allowed it to go to waste. For those of you who do not know my background, I am the oldest of 6 children. Often families would be invited to share lunch with us after church. My mother never noticed anybody extra. There were so many of us. And I do remember that it wasn't always a fancy lunch. In fact, one of my family's favorites, my mother would make what she called White Castles. And there would be a platter in the middle of the table like this. That lunch, though, after church was how we got to know each other better, and we were able to form lasting friendships and relationships. I remember that for about a year, we would pick up a young man who was a member of the church, but he was stationed at Rickenbacker Air Force Base. And we would take him to church with us. Now you have to understand there are 8 of us. We do not have a station wagon. We have a regular car. So I'm certain that this poor young man, I don't remember, but I'm sure he had to have somebody on his lap. But it was understood after the first time we took him to church that he would be expected to come home with us for lunch, unless he had other responsibilities at the air base. And that led to a very close relationship with his family in Independence, Missouri. The Sabbath is anchored in caring for others and for self. We are given the opportunity by God and his Son, who love us so much, to rest and renew. Jesus and his disciples, as they walked from one place to another, took this time to spend time in sacred renewal. This was the time that the disciples learned to reflect upon the things that Jesus had taught them. We too need refreshment for our souls. The Sabbath is more than a day off. It is an opportunity to be a blessing to others. We need to honor God with our worship and our Sabbath activities. I would challenge all of us today, myself included, to pray about how God would have us observe the Sabbath. Ask him to help you to evaluate what you do and how you do it. Is it honoring our God and his Son, Jesus Christ? Does it offer rest for your body and refreshment for your spirit?